Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming to this discussion of The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's classic novel about a woman named Offred and the oppressive landscape that she is forced to navigate. This year, the book was turned into a TV series on Hulu, which was recently renewed for a second season. My name is Maddie Crum. I'm a culture writer at HuffPost, and I'll be moderating this discussion between Bruce Miller and Margaret Atwood, who really needs no introduction, but I'll introduce them both anyway. Bruce Miller is a writer and producer whose recent projects include The 100, an adaptation of Cass Morgan's post-apocalyptic series, and, of course, The Handmaid's Tale, the new Hulu series that's in the midst of its first season. Margaret Atwood is the author of Cat's Eye, The Blind Assassin, the Mad Adam trilogy, and of course, The Handmaid's Tale. She's written several collections of poetry and short fiction, and she's won an Arthur C. Clarke Award and has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Her latest book, Hagaseed, is an update on Shakespeare's The Tempest, and she's got a tote bag with The Tempest on it with her today. Fun fact. So I thought I wanted to start off by asking you both about The Handmaid's Tale in 1985 and how it was received then, and then we can talk about The Handmaid's Tale in 2017 and what the story means today. And we'll save the last 15 minutes or so for audience questions, so have your questions at the ready. So Margaret, you've written a new introduction to the book, which reveals some of your motivations behind writing it. In that introduction, you note that you read a lot of science fiction growing up, but that you avoided writing in the genre yourself for a long time. So what was it that deterred you from writing a science fiction story, and why did you finally decide to write them?
Well, what a question. So, yes, I did read a lot of books of a non-naturalistic, non-realistic kind. It was the 50s, long before you were born. And publishing in that decade, most notably, were Ray Bradbury and John Wyndham. But before that time, we had Brave New World, which appeared in the 30s, and 1984, which appeared just in time for me to read it as a young teen-aged person. So I still have my original copy of it. This was the early days of paperbacks, and paperbacks were distributed in drugstores, and they had cheesy covers on them, because that encouraged people to buy them. People would look at the cheesy covers and say, this is not going to be too complicated for me. And that is how I read a lot of books. As a young person, you would get this cheesy cover, and it would turn out to be William Faulkner or Hemingway. And in this case, 1984, which had a lot of cleavage and leering on the cover. And I still have that book with that very same cover on it. So I was sort of immersed in this. I think a lot of kids, early teenage years, later teenage years, are attracted to this kind of book because it's like invent a world, or it's like the world could be different from what we think it is. And along with that, I was also reading other kinds of books that tied in with it. There was a book by Arthur Koestler called Darkness at Noon, which was about the Soviet purges, Soviet show trials. And it fitted right in with 1984. So remember when I was born, it was 1939. What happened in that year? What began in that year? World War II, you're right. So that was a formative event in my life. And in the late 40s, it was the golden age of comic books, with a lot of action heroes. We didn't have television yet. And it was also the golden age of radio drama. So there was a lot of this kind of thinking around. And therefore, it was natural for me to continue reading those kinds of books, even though they were frowned upon by respectable people. But I never was too worried about that. I grew up in the woods. I was not properly socialized, so I didn't care whether I was reading respectable books or not. I mean, it's not that I was averse to reading them, but I didn't feel limited to that. And my dad was a scientist, and he liked to read sci-fi because he thought it was funny. So I read quite early. Do you know a book called R.U.R.? It's the first robot book. And
In
one
what
called,
year was that published?
that was pretty early. It was a play to begin with, R.U.R. It was, this is the guy who invented the word robot, Karl Čapek, who was Czechoslovakian. And also one called Penguin Island. This is going to be outside the circle of what most people have read, by Anatole France. Ring a bell? No.
Not at all.
No. Anyway, so all of those sorts of things. So I liked them, but I didn't feel able to write them. And I think I decided to give it a try because there was a conjunction of three things. Number one, my study of 17th century American Puritans, not a democracy, just letting you know that. It's not, it was a theocracy. My study of early utopias and dystopias, which I, of course, yearned to write one, but had not felt able to do it. And in the early 1980s, the rise of the religious right, who were saying at that time, that long ago, what they would like to do if they ever got the power to do it. So remember what year I was born. It was 1939. Who was World War II with? It was with Hitler. What did Hitler write in the 20s? He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, and in it he said all of the things he would like to do if he got the power to do it. And then he did get the power to do it, and then he did them. So I've never been a person who believed it can't happen here, and I've never been a person to believe, oh, they're just funning. You know, those are just the things, they're just fooling around, it's just to get votes. I don't believe that. I believe that people will actually do the things they say they're going to do if they get a chance to do them. So my question to myself was, if America were going to have a dictatorship, what kind of dictatorship would it be? And therefore that was the answer, and it was based on history and probability given the early 1980s, and what it definitely would not be. It would definitely not have been an atheist communist dictatorship. No. What's your other choice? So like that.
That segs nicely into my next question, which is also related to your new introduction. You said that in the book you only wanted the story to include things that have already happened over the course of human history, and of course the book references the Bible, but what are some other historical references or resources or events that you considered in writing The Handmaid's Tale? Okay,
so everything in it is based on something that people have already done, usually multiple times. I have a questionnaire that was just sent to me by a French publication asking the very same question. So I thought I would give them some French examples. And one of the most, topic, people torn apart by mobs. That's in episode 1. So people torn apart by mobs, there are 2 French references that I will give them. One is the Princesse de Lamballe in the French Revolution, who was torn apart by a mob. And the other one is from a novel by Zola, based on real stuff. Takes place in a coal mining town in which there's a company town, and there's a revolt against the oppressive coal mining regime. And the manager of the company store gets torn apart by a mob because he has been sexually exploiting the women and the wives and daughters of the coal miners because they don't have any money. Okay, like that. So he gets torn apart by a mob. With the Princesse de Lamballe, it was her head that was paraded around town on a pike with the coal mining example, it was another part of this man's anatomy that was, think hot dogs.
What do you mean?
Well, Zola was a pretty graphic writer. What can I say?
So
the French will like that because they're French examples, right?
So this is BookCon, but I want to talk about the TV show as well and loop Bruce into this conversation. So I guess broadly, first, how and when did you both get involved with the adaptation? Just walk me through that.
Well, Margaret got involved with it when she wrote the book. But I read the book in college in a new fiction class, which tells you how long ago I was in college. And I was attracted to it completely as a work of literature and to Offred's character, kind of the fact that she could maintain a resistance in such an oppressive situation and maintain her sense of self and her sense of humor and a sense of hope. And so I read it in college, and I read it a bunch of times over the years. I'm mildly to super dyslexic, so I tend to read the same books over and over again. I don't know why it's related. And so I was excited to see the movie, and then I was excited to hear that they were making a TV show out of it, but years went by and it didn't come out, and I was just excited as a fan of the book. And then the opportunity came along where they were looking for someone to come in and write a new pilot and write the TV show. But I'm a boy. I'm not a woman, and they were looking for a...
We can fix that.
Yes, today's technology. Yeah. And so, and they were looking for a female showrunner, which I was 100% behind if I didn't want the job so very, very much. We settled that out, you know, and it was very lucky. And so as soon as I got the job, Margaret and I started, talking via email, and then we met in Toronto. And it was a very, I think interestingly, Margaret had a lot more experience having this particular novel adapted than I had experienced adapting novels at all. It was a book that had already been a movie, a play, an opera, a ballet. Yeah, and so, in fact, it was her encouragement to think freely and think about adapting the book to another medium, something she had done many times before, that made it a lot easier to think big and to think about big changes in other parts of the world to dramatize. And then I had to send her the 2 scripts that I wrote. So, if you will, for a minute, imagine that. You write 2 episodes of The Handmaid's Tale and then have to send it to Margaret. I didn't go to the bathroom that weekend. But she was very, very, whether she liked it or not, she was exceedingly kind to me, and and it's continued ever since. It's been she's been very generous the whole time. So, thank you.
Well, you've kept to the core premise, which is nothing goes in that doesn't have a real life referent. So it's not just making stuff up. You have to be able to point to the real world and say, this is where I got, these are the multiple reference for this particular thing. I have to say also that I'd always read a lot of prison memoirs, gulag memoirs, concentration camp memoirs, and people who had got through. People who had managed to get through it somehow, and how they had got through. So their inner life, how they had managed to stay sane, keep focused, not die.
Well, I think
the
fact that it was tethered to the real world is something we've tried to keep going in the show. Otherwise, it just turns into kind of coming up with cruel things to do to people, mostly women, and that doesn't seem like a very good enterprise to be advancing. So, and living in the world that we do, with not just so many cruel things happening, but so much more information about it, we found that we haven't had to go astray from from finding examples in the real world, even in either currently or in very recent history. So it makes it very difficult for us when we write to have to do all that research. But people like Margaret and the UN and Planned Parenthood and NARAL and all these places have been incredibly helpful and generous in terms of keeping us on the right track. It's very easy to slip into kind of a version of violent pornography when you're just coming up with cruelties, and we certainly don't want to fall down that road.
Yeah, well, there's a number of other areas as well. For instance, there are now 13 countries in the world where homosexuality is a hanging crime, punishable by death.
Mm-hmm.
So I built that in as well because that was happening back in the 80s too. And as far as killing people because they're of another religion, that has such a history. Lots and lots of examples of that currently and also far back in history.
Unfortunately, all the things that Margaret mentioned in the book are still very easy to find happening now. So it was, that's disappointing, but it is something that we try to reflect in the show.
Yeah, I'd love to ask about that. Production and filming must have began long before last year's presidential election, but now much of the conversation around the show is about how relevant it is today. So could each of you speak a little bit to that?
I started writing the pilot script probably well before even the primaries began, before those debates began, and I had finished before that season got into full swing, and we were writing during the election, and I'm sure it influenced us. You
were filming during the election,
and then we were filming during we were filmed on election eve and election day.
You started in September. Yeah,
we started in September. So through the whole process of choosing candidates and our exceedingly long campaigns, it was part of what we were experiencing, and I don't know whether for me it didn't change consciously what we were doing. It unfortunately made it easier to find examples, but also easier to find the language that people use to justify this kind of thinking. The fact that people were more comfortable speaking about things that I thought were, kind of terrible, heinous ways to think about the world. The fact that at least you had people explaining it to you, even if you didn't agree, that was very helpful to us as writers, because your stories is only as good as your villain. Alan Rickman is a lot better than Bruce Willis in Die Hard. So it's so you have to be able to understand and have true compassion for the people in it who are enemies, who seem to be the bad guys. There are no bad guys in their own mind.
They're not bad guys in their own mind, and I think that's important to understand. There are very few people who think they are bad guys.
Anybody think they're a bad guy?
Margaret, you've been fairly active on social media, using the book as a means of discussing issues such as library funding and free speech. So how do you think of the relationship between your art and your activism? And this question can be for both of you, of course.
Yeah, well, people usually have it backwards. They think that you take these things that you believe and you put them into books, like you would put the raisins into the Raisin Bran. But I don't think that's really how it happens. I think what actually really happens, first of all, I'm not a real activist. Real activists, it's their job. They work with organizations, they get paid. I am a person who doesn't have a job, and therefore I cannot be fired, and therefore I frequently get asked to speak about these things because other people would like to speak about them, but if they spoke about them, they would get fired, except for real activists whose job it is to speak about them. It's not actually my job to speak about them. I get asked to speak about them because I don't have a job. My real job, if you like, is writing. That's the thing that I do, and it's because I do that I don't have a job. You can put all that together. I don't have another sort of job that I could be fired for. So in a totalitarianism, of course, I'd be shot immediately. because they go for the writers and artists first. They get rid of the independent voices. So lucky me, the fact that I'm still among you indicates that you're not there yet. You are not yet in a real totalitarianism. So goody. And nor would the show be on the television if you were.
Bruce?
I don't have any idea what the question was.
I'll move on then.
Yeah, your activism.
It's a little bit different with a TV series, just because a book is finished and it comes out and then there's reaction to it. But this is an ongoing machine. It's like, you're building the car during the Indy 500 all the time.
That's true.
And so there's a little bit of, I'm in a difficult position. I certainly don't want to tell people how to respond to the show. I don't want to tell them ahead of time how they're supposed to feel. That seems to be the definition of mansplaining for me to tell people that this is this show or that show. But on the other hand, you want to get out there and talk about the stuff that you have written. So it's been dicey. I mean, I had been thinking about this book for a very, very long time, and I'm very close to the book. But I am, a curious news junkie, but no more politically astute than any other curious news junkie. So I do feel a little at sea and out of my depth when it comes to those kind of discussions. And I'm very happy that the show is sparking them, and I'm very happy to keep pushing the show to spark more of them. I mean, we have been supported quite well by Hulu and MGM. Every time I think they're going to balk and say you can't put that on television, they seem to embrace it. And we've done, I don't know if you guys have been watching, but we've done some stuff that they don't put on television. The most controversial was showing someone's period on their underwear, which seemed strangely not controversial to me.
But unprecedented.
Well, at least it's not like those ads in which bodily fluids are blue. I think that it's confused a lot of people, a lot of children. Mommy, why isn't my pee blue? I'm abnormal. Yeah, like that. So at least it was the right color. Yeah.
But my daughter, I have a daughter who's 12, who was, so confused by all the feminine product ads. She couldn't figure out what the story was because it's all euphemisms.
Yes.
And so I would never in a million years let her watch the show, but hopefully it would illuminate things a little. In 10 years when she can watch.
Well,
Back in the 50s.
Back in the 50s, things were even more coded. So it was magazine ads, and there was this product called Modesse. That was a feminine product. Feminine product. And the ad was simply, you would see a woman is anybody old enough to remember this? You would see a woman in a very glamorous evening gown, sort of ascending a staircase with drapery rippling in the wind and the blue Aegean Sea in the background. And the ad would say, Modesse, because. So, prompting the child mind to say, Mom, because what?
Yeah.
Never mind. You'll understand that later.
I don't know why you would call the product Always. That seems like the worst aspect of menstruation that you want to emphasize, like always. Oh my God, it's going to be always.
You want it to be called Only Occasionally.
Yeah, only occasionally, and at some point it'll stop. Yeah.
Well, I think what it's supposed to suggest is that you can always depend upon it.
Depends or something else.
Same idea.
Yeah.
Oh, different. Never mind. So like that. But the ones I liked much better at that time were put out by the Kotex company, and they were 20 questions things. Like you would get a question such as, "What do you do if?" And it would be, what do you do if you're going to the prom and you think your hands are perspiring too much? Do you A, put talcum powder on them, B, wear long white gloves, C, wipe them on the back of your date's jacket? And then there would be a right answer. And then the fourth panel would be, what do you do on, quotes, those days? Those days. Mom, what are those days? Never mind.
The euphemisms do get us in more trouble than anything else.
But I think it's the beginning of surrealism and of literary metaphor. So you understand that this stands for that, except you're just not always sure what that is. And that gives us Shakespeare. What can I say?
I wish I had some follow-up questions about feminine product branding, but unfortunately not. So I do have some questions about some of the differences between the book and the show. One choice that I found really interesting was that the book is very much Offred's story. It's very close in on her perspective, and the show chooses to go into Serena Joy's life and Luke's, and we really get to learn more about the other characters in the book. So why did you choose to make that decision? What, I don't know, just tell me about that.
Because it's a television show.
That's fair.
Well, I think, I'm sure most of the people here have read *Handmaid's Tale*. I just followed my curiosity.
And then you say, if not, why not?
Yes. If not, raise your hand. It always just seemed like there were parts of the book that were tantalizing, and but we did, and we still do. It is from Offred's point of view, and even what we try to say is that every story is a June story, whether it's the story about Offred's experience in Gilead, or whether the story of what happens to Luke, or even Serena Joy. We try not to tell another story where it doesn't, knowing that story doesn't impact on June's life as a handmaid and her chances of survival. I mean, it's a very strange world where if Serena Joy gets in a fight with her friend, Offred pays, even though she wasn't involved at all. So all of the satellite events that are happening always come in on her. And so, it goes to following the story to other worlds, whether we go to the colonies or whether we go into the criminal justice system. Those were really just areas that when I read the book, just completely as a reader, I was curious about.
Yes, and the book leaves them open. So they're in the book. They're
Thank
all
you.
open questions because she cannot know the answers. She can't read. She's not allowed to read. She's not allowed to question people. So that when Offglen disappears from her life, she has no way of knowing what has happened.
It's such an interesting. It translates so interestingly into our time because of the internet and because of the way especially my kids. I have a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old as well. And the way that knowledge is really easily accessible, and the thing that drives them crazy in the show is that she can't know. And we're so used to knowing so
we're used to thinking we know,
yes,
which is
especially
different.
my children.
Yeah, so you go back maybe 200 years before there was a telephone, before there was a telegraph, and then you take away reading. So no letters, no newspapers. How can you know? Gossip, word of mouth, if you trust the other person enough. And that in a totalitarian dictatorship is always a very dangerous thing to do.
You take away every dependable source of information, not just every
Yes,
source
but
of
you also
information.
take away any certainty of being able to trust other people.
Mhm.
And when we premiered the original feature film back in 1990, it was just as the Berlin Wall was coming down, just at that moment. So we had two premieres. We had one of them in West Berlin, where the post-showing conversation was about aesthetic matters, the direction, the acting, the artistic choices, because they didn't really believe at that moment in Western Germany that the United States would ever do anything like that. They didn't believe it. They had done all their religious warfare in the 17th, 16th, 17th centuries. So overdone, we're not going to do that again. We might have, a Hitler, but we're not going to have a theocracy. And anyway, America is the land of the brave and the home of the free. They would never, ever do. They would never subvert their own democracy, thought they. Kennedy had just been there a couple of decades before, supporting West Berlin with the wonderful German sentence, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I am a jelly donut, but they didn't, nobody laughed. They said we knew what he meant. Then we went to East Germany, and they watched it in an entirely different way. It was framed very differently. So they watched it, and afterwards they said, this was our life, by which they meant you didn't know who to trust. You couldn't communicate because you did not know who to trust. And now that we've opened the Stasi records and seen the film The Lives of Others, we know exactly how true that was.
And it ties back to your question about making Offred the center of this story, or making June the center. The closest relationship and the biggest conflict, at least as I see it in the show, is between June and Offred. Is that Offred is pushing, compliance, while June is pushing, rebellion and trying to live even while you're trying to survive. And it ends up being the only person she can trust. The only person she can have an open relationship is June and Offred are the only two people who can really have an open relationship. And that's what makes the story cool, but it also makes it only possible to do if you have Lizzie. I mean, she's
right.
She's uniquely talented. Yes. And lovely, just by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to ask about one other difference between the book and the show. The improvements made to the environment in Gilead and just the topic of climate change in general are certainly in the book, but they've become a much bigger part of the story with the show. So why is that?
I think it was just an extrapolation of what was in the book in terms of the combination of environmental disaster or more environmental dirtiness, and the fact that people were having a fertility crisis.
That's happening now,
it's
by
happening
the way.
Now, yeah.
It's chemicals from plastics in the water.
And
it's male fertility going down. But you're not allowed to you're not allowed to say that in Gilead because in Scripture it's always the woman's fault. See Henry VIII.
Oh, and so it seemed like a natural extrapolation to say that Gilead would be trying to take care of that problem if they were trying to take care of the infertility problem in lots of other areas. I also honestly just thought every time Gilead does something that I think is good, it makes me feel ooky. And so that's, I think, that's it goes back. I read a biography of Hitler once. Just it'll actually make sense. And in it, they talk about this town that Hitler just loved visiting and how beautiful it was in Germany. And I said to my wife, should we go visit it? And then you feel like, do I want to take travel advice from Hitler? I mean, he's not a bad, evil traveler. He's just, and so it's the same thing when you find something that you put Gilead in such a box of everything they do I hate, and then you put in some things that you support. It just makes it a more interesting viewing experience, I think.
Yes, that's true. I mean, and as you said, I think on another occasion, people said this it looks so lush, it looks so beautiful, it looks so leafy, and the colors are so saturated, and you said, well, a lot of dystopias, everything's like laid waste and
dusty and rubble and
lots of rubble robots. and what have you, and it makes it much more real to us to have it the other way around.
And to the point where when we do the sound for the show, we cut out all the sounds of cars, even in the distance. There's no planes, and there are probably 10 or 20 times the number of bird songs
You added in.
We add in birds that don't really exist in that part of Massachusetts anymore.
You're going
because
to
it's
hear
Margaret,
about that
yeah.
from the bird
Yes.
people. You know.
No, it's on purpose that they've come back to Massachusetts.
Okay.
So all of those things. I mean, the anal attention to detail on the show or on any TV show is quite amazing. But the sound guys put together a world that sounds very different from our world, and you may not notice it when you watch, but you do feel it.
You feel that it's eerily quiet.
Yes.
Yes.
And all the cars are either hybrids or, except for the military
Yes,
vehicles.
they're eerily quiet
Yeah,
too.
because they're eerily quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of juxtaposed with the loud protest songs that June hears in her head that you chose for the soundtrack.
Yes, the people are also eerily quiet,
Right.
Yeah.
as one would be.
Yeah.
So before we open it up to questions, I just want to ask each of you, on behalf of everyone who loved both iterations of the show, if you have any books or shows that you would recommend for them to continue reading that's similar or related, or just what you would recommend.
Well, if you want to creep yourself out, you can watch a series called The Rise of the Nazi Party. That will make you feel very weird. It's basically how he did it.
I actually would recommend the same kind of thing. William Shirer, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It was written then. It was written by a journalist who actually lived through it, and it's so interesting, kind of just the day-to-day of what what happened between the Monday and the Tuesday when the laws came down that Jews can own businesses. It's all very interesting, and that kind of on-the-ground detail was really important to us in the show, because it's really hard to imagine, okay, well, I understand theoretically how these things happen, but how do they happen?
They happen at a moment in time.
Yeah, there's a time.
You're showing that moment in time.
Yeah.
I think it's episode 2.
Yeah, where we're trying
that moment.
Yeah, we always try to focus in on the kind of that little tipping point. So you try to choose exactly the right scene where you show something. There's a scene later where June and Luke are in bed and they're cuddling, and she's very upset about losing her job. And to me, that was the moment it became a totalitarian state, when the state actually gets in your bedroom, then it controls the total person. So that's why that scene is there.
Yes, he's feeling cuddly and she isn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
Totalitarianism will ruin your sex life. That's what
And with that, if you have questions, there are 2 microphones.
It's a wonderful panel. You're just terrific. Miss Atwood, I think it's accurate to refer to you as a visionary. And today in our country, we are seeing an administration that is moving farther and farther to the right and becoming more and more of a handmaiden to the mega rich, and also to the religious extremists that also dwell among us. Having said all this, I remember 1980 very well. I remember Jerry Falwell. I remember all of the television preachers. Where do we go from here? I mean, we're one Supreme Court seat from overturning gay marriage. It's virtually impossible for a woman to have an abortion in the state of Texas today, even if it means her dying, not getting it. What do you think is going to happen now?
Well, first of all, I'm not really a visionary. I'm not a prophet, and except insofar as people look at the present and extrapolate from it, and that's really all anybody can do, unless they have clairvoyant second sight, which I do not have, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. Sometimes people have to live their dream. So if living their dream means a lot of dead women and orphans, maybe they're going to have to live that dream. And maybe they're just then going to have to figure out who's going to pay for this. Who's going to pay for the orphans? and the dead women, because that's what you're going to have. And I'm waiting for the first lawsuit. I'm waiting, in which the family of the dead woman sues the state. And I'm also waiting for a lawsuit that says, if you force me to have children that I cannot afford, you should pay for the whole process. You should pay for my... You should pay for my prenatal care. You should pay for my otherwise very expensive hospital delivery. You should pay for my health insurance. You should pay for the upkeep of this child after it is born, because that's where the concern seems to cut off with these people. Once you take your first breath, out the window with you. And it is really a form of slavery to force women to have children that they cannot afford, and then to say that they have to raise them. So if that's not going to be the story, you're going to end up with Romania under Ceausescu, in which the orphanages fill up. Romania under Ceausescu, for those who don't remember it, he mandated 4 children per woman, and you had to have a pregnancy test every month. And if you did not get pregnant, you had to state why. Why you had not gotten pregnant. I mean, it was nuts. And it did result in a number of suicides and a number of kids being put into orphanages with no proper care at all. I mean, it was just horrible. So that's what you want, state of Texas. Live your dream. We can all watch and see what that looks like, and whether you're actually going to go so far as to force this upon women and families, and not pay for any of it. If you're drafted into the Army, the other situation in which the state seizes control of your body, at least you get 3 meals a day, clothing, and a place to sleep. So you're going to do that to women, pay up.
Thank you.
So in your short story, Alphenland, you have a fantasy author who is sort of frustrated with the convention scene and with specifically young fans who really empathize with like the darker characters and try and dress up as them and channel their darker side. So now that The Handmaid's Tale is like having this resurgence and has a fan scene and people dressing up as characters and stuff like that, are you finding that to be true? Or what's been your experience with that?
Of myself. Well, I'm not the characters in my books, believe it or not. I did have one guy say to me, "So The Handmaid's Tale is autobiographical?" And I said, "No, it's not." I said, no, it's not. And he said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "No, it's not. It takes place in the future." And he said, "That's no excuse." So there are people who will believe it's you no matter what you do. But no, I'm not that character fun, though I had writing it. And no, I don't have a problem going to Comic-Con, where I have been, and wearing cat's ears, which I have done. So that's not my problem. Yes, it's not my problem. It is the problem of the character in the story, because she is about getting a bit fed up with people telling her what kinds of dragons are the right kinds of dragons. And her kind are the wrong kind. So there are people who will always think they know better about your story than you know yourself.
Hi. This is a question for both panelists. But when I read the book originally, one of the things that creeped me out the most was the epilogue, where you watch scientists of the even further future look back on Gilead and comment on it. And one of the refrains is that, we can't judge them because we aren't them. We don't understand the pressures that they were under at the moment. Do you think that, for both of you, do you think that we will look back on history in the same way?
We already do that.
Right.
That's why I could write that section.
Uh-huh.
If you read history books quite a lot, which I do, you will find those kinds of things, and to a certain extent, that's true.
Right.
We aren't there. We're not 17th century Puritan New England people who really, really believe there are witches. Well, maybe we are. But so we look at the Salem witch trials and we think, oh, bad people. But they really believed that. You know, they really believed that there were demonic forces and that people could channel them and harm other people. They believed all of that. So what is your judgment upon them going to be?
Right.
Like that.
Well, for us in the show, for myself and the rest of the writing staff, we're incredibly judgy.
Okay.
And I think that probably my feeling about that part of the epilogue was always that that's the easy way out, is to say, well, we're not here to judge. I actually think it's one of the most important parts of reading history, is to be able to put yourself in that time and actually feel it as if you are someone in that time. And yeah, it's hard to dive in and say these people were right and these people were wrong, but that's what you do when you get historian after your name.
And remember that the epilogue is talking to the reader.
Right.
And the reader comes to that part and goes and says to him or herself just what you said. Hey, wait a minute. I am too judging them. And that is the effect that a statement like that has upon the reader.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. I have a general question also for the panelists. In your new introduction, you wrote the phrase, most people say this would never happen here. And this is kind of similar to the question that was asked. A lot of times, I think human beings are cyclical. We look back on the time before us and we say, we would have never done that. We would have never been okay with this. And people probably after us will think the same thing. We would have never elected that. We would have never done that. We would have never, So my question is, at what point, as a person present, just thinking as a person, would we know that we are at that turning point, that we are at that point in which someone in the future is going to look back and say, ooh, how did those people,
You can't know.
Well,
That's the problem, because now is now.
yeah.
And unless you do have clairvoyant second sight, the
Unfortunately not.
future doesn't exist. It's an infinite number of possible futures, and you don't know which one is going to come true.
Yeah.
Suppose the worst, and suppose a future in which people are saying, well, why didn't they elect Donald Trump sooner? It could go that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think your question is more about the people in the future than the people now. And they're going to be just as disparate as the opinions are in this room and in this state and this country. So I think that's the real question. Is it reflects more on the times in the past that we're the most critical of. I think reflect more on us than those times, or at least just as much on us as those times.
It's sort of like the bad guy question. People at the time don't think they're doing the bad thing.
Yeah.
They think they're making, of all the possible decisions, even suppose all of them are bad ones, they think they're choosing the best one. Because people try not to act in their own worst interests. They may not see that this thing that they have done is in their own worst interests, but they think they're choosing the best thing.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Margaret Atwood, for writing and being here and sharing your thoughts and humor with us too. I have two questions. So earlier you mentioned you read these works of fiction, utopias, and that you felt at the time you didn't have the confidence to write a book like that. One, and how did you sort of decide that you could create a work of literature as you did? And secondly, for those who watch the show and haven't read the books, do you suggest that everyone should read the book because there's something in there that can't be captured on the screen?
That's for me. Writers should avoid saying things like, everybody should read my book. It sounds sort of terminally self-serving. And because I'm Canadian, double plus ungood to say such a thing. You're supposed to say more like, well, it's not bad, and maybe you can read it if you really want to do it, but otherwise, like that. What was the first one? Oh yeah, what made me think that I was now going to do it? I avoided doing it for several years. I thought that I should maybe write some other book, because doing The Handmaid's Tale, although I had it in my mind, I thought it was just too crazy. That nobody would believe it, I would get in trouble, all the reasons that you don't do these things. But I did try the other book, and it was a screaming disaster. And I didn't finish it because it wasn't holding my attention, because what I really wanted to write was The Handmaid's Tale. So I finally, being Canadian, I go swimming in cold lakes quite a lot, because we don't actually have any warm lakes. And the best way of going swimming in a cold lake is just to plunge in. Otherwise, you'll never do it. You stick your foot in, it's cold. You take it out, you stick it in, you take it out. You can go on like that for a long time. So I just plunged in. And it was either going to work or it wasn't. And the beauty of writing as an art form, you're never there in the room at the same time as the person who's reading it while you're writing it. And just because you're writing something doesn't mean you have to publish it. So why not try it? Nobody's going to see unless you show it to them. So I guess it was try it and see if it works. And I would know if it wasn't working. And then I wouldn't have published it. So all of the writers out there, nobody's going to see it unless you show it to them, so why not try it? There's nothing stopping you.
And I would say that the basis of what Margaret says is I tend to write things that I just can't not write. Things that when you do what I do, write television, there are basically 3 rules that they tell you at the beginning. Never write anything that might be science fiction, never do flashbacks, and never do voiceover. And
you did them all.
Yes, and I did them all. So in the first episode, I did them all. And so, you do try to avoid all of those things until you realize, okay, this is the idea I want to write, or, oh, this is the way I want to do it, because you can't seem to forget about it. And in terms of whether you should, I love the book, and I think the book, I would encourage you before, during, or after the series to read it. I mean, there's lots and lots of fun differences. There's also lots of things in the show that you won't. There are lots of things in the show that are there as a reward for reading the book. Things that are mentioned or nodded out that would fly by you if you hadn't read the book. So that just to make you buy the book. That's the goal here.
So I think we actually, unfortunately, only have time for one more question. So,
hi. One thing that's always fascinated me about Gilead has been the portrayal of the economic situation. And I was really surprised watching the first few episodes to see a degree of opulence that I had never envisioned for Gilead, for these households. I always thought that there would be some sort of lack that would have driven people to this, and that they would be recovering from that, some degree of economic crisis or poverty. And so I'm curious about the decision to put in, I know we talked about like the setting the scene and having it be so green and lush, but also just the amount of amenities and wealth that's available in the show that's portrayed there.
Yep. So these are the top people. The other thing about totalitarianisms is the people at the top get the good stuff. It's sort of like society in general, but it's more enforced in a totalitarianism. So Joe Stalin and his pals were not lacking in stuff, and neither were the top brass of the Nazi Party in Germany. It was actually pretty opulent until everything fell apart. So you're seeing the inside of a top household, and you'll notice that the way they've done it is there's a lot of physical stuff that is old. So the physical stuff was already there. They just got it. They have that stuff. But it's not new stuff that is being made. It's old stuff that they have got. And when you think of how those things work, a lot of old stuff changed hands under the Nazis because they stole it. And then they had it, right? So that's kind of how those things work.
We did look at the way that the Nazis took over the houses of the people that they kicked out of any society. Also, there's a lot of stuff in the house that's looted. All the pictures on the wall in the Waterford House are pictures from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so they've all been taken, and so there's different ones. The ones in the commander's office are a little more chancy, but they're all, and except for one.
Did you get to use the real pictures, or are they prints?
We had some very nice anonymous gentlemen in China paint them all for us. For
He
like
painted them.
Yeah, for like 20
Wow.
bucks each. It was amazing.
Wow.
And they're beautiful. And except for one or two, they're life size. I wanted to put in a particular Singer Sargent painting, and
Which one? The Isabella Stewart one,
it's
and
the girl laying back.
Oh, that one. Okay.
And it's enormous. So we put in a smaller version of that. But pretty much everything else is. And that was it's the one writing you have in the house is the signatures of the artists in the corners of the paintings. So it is they're sucking off the bigger economy that came before. But you also there's no computers, there's no TVs, there's a lot of things, expensive things that they don't have, so that they have money left over for this kind of opulence.
When I was writing the book, when I was first started writing the book, which was in West Berlin in 1984, I also traveled to East Berlin and to Czechoslovakia and to Poland. And one of the things that would happen to you on those trips was that you would be taken to some building or other, very nice buildings that had been expropriated by the state and turned into something or other. And then somebody would take you aside and off the record tell you who had owned it before and what had happened to them and when.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Bruce and Margaret, and thank you everyone for coming. And enjoy the rest of BookCon.